Hello. So, okay, now sensory memory. All right. So we need to talk a little bit, and they do talk a little bit about, kind of how much information can be stored in these different memory storage areas, and how long can it be stored there, right? So they start with sensory memory, and they start with, we mentioned two kinds of sensory memory in the textbook. You've got iconic memory. Iconic memory is referring to visual sensory memory. The icon, which is where they got the name for the icons on the computer screen. There's a little trivia there for you. Icon. But anyway, it's a visual stimulus, right? Um, so this was, earlier in the 20th century, Sperling was investigating uh, how much information could be stored in iconic memory, right? Visual sensory memory. And he presented a visual array of letters to participants, for a very short period of time, and he asked them to remember as much as they could in this visual array. And once it disappeared, report as many of the letters as they could remember. Well, they couldn't report very much initially, like 3 or 4 letters, right, out of the 12 that were on the visual stimulus array. I know the book has a picture of a slide that has 9 letters on it. The actual slide had 12 letters on it. I don't know why they skimped on that in the textbook, but anyway, right? So initially he's thinking, oh, well, heck, the capacity, what's the capacity of iconic? It's very small. The capacity refers to how much information can be stored there, all right? But participants also said that they felt like they could remember more than they could report. So he varied, right, the experimental setup. And what he did is he'd present the stimulus array, and as soon as the stimulus array, it's just there for a very brief period of time, as soon as it disappears, there'd be a tone, a high, middle, or low-pitched tone. And that auditory tone is a cue, right? C-U-E, a cue that tells them to report which line of the visual stimulus. So if it's a high-pitched tone, they're supposed to report the top line of letters. Middle pitch, the middle line of letters. The low pitch, the low line of letters. Like how I do that? Low, middle, high. But anyway. And when he did that, they could report whatever row they were cued to report, right? So the conclusion was the entire visual array was stored in sensory memory. It's just that the retention duration, how long the information is held there, is very short. So if they're trying to report all 12, they would fade away. They would not be retained. They would just fade away before they could report them all. But if you gave them the proper cue and told them what part, right, of their iconic memory to pay attention to and report, they could do it. All right? So the conclusion ultimately was that the capacity of iconic memory, visual sensory memory, is relatively large. It included everything in that visual array anyway. It's just that the retention duration, how long the information was held for, it's just a fraction of a second. Right? It's there for a fraction of a second, and that's it. Then it's gone. All right? And, I don't know if you've ever walked into, from a well-lit area, all of a sudden into the darkened theater, or well, that's not a good example. If you're in a room, that's well lit, and then the lights go out, for a fraction of a second, you can still see the room, right? It's just hopefully you've been in that room before and you have a long-term memory for where things are too to help you get around. But anyway, so then they do also mention echoic memory, the echoic memory for, I wonder what sense this is about. Yes. Auditory sensory memory is the echo or echoic memory. There, once again, research of a similar fashion, just set up differently for the auditory sense demonstrated that auditory sensory memory or echoic sensory memory has a relatively large capacity. The retention duration of information in echoic memory is a little bit longer, it's 3 to 4 seconds, right? Now, if you think about it for iconic memory, for visual sensory memory, it makes sense that memory just has to be a fraction of a second and gone, right? Because when I'm walking around, we use vision, right? It's our primary sense, perhaps, right, to survive. When I'm looking over here and then I'm looking over here, well, now when I'm looking over here, I don't need the memory from when I was looking over there interfering with what I'm looking at now, right? So you can't have, so retention duration of iconic sensory memory, it can't be long or it's going to screw up my vision of where I'm looking right now. When you think about echoic memory, it's around for 3 or 4 seconds. That makes more sense too, especially when you talk about human beings and our reliance on language, right? Well, you need to retain auditory information a little bit longer so that by the time I get to the end of the sentence, you can still remember the beginning of it and make sense out of what I am saying. Yes. So anyway, that's some sensory memory stuff.